part of our sense of how we're responding to these movements is the areas we've studied, the areas we lived, what we know. And I spent my time in the cone of Latin America, and I spent my time in Chile, which I must say is a very successful example, and I see parallels all over with Egypt. So let me start by doing the opposite of Mark and saying what's different, and then I'll talk about what's similar. All right, so what's different? Latin America has a number of real advantages. One, long democratic histories. For most of the history, Uruguay and Chile were democratic, parties still active. All they have to do is reassert themselves, and familiarity with democratic processes. Second, states really much, much more dependent on the US. We say these regimes are dependent on the US, but they also have oil. They have other sources of power. When the US shifted its position on democracy in these regimes, had a very strong impact. So those two things in themselves, really do give Latin America an edge. That being said, there is a lot to see in the Latin American examples that at least spell positive for some of the Middle Eastern. And I'm going to talk about Chile and Egypt, because talking about emotions, I watched Egypt and I get emotional. So I think that there is plenty of emotion in social movements. And I think partly scholars haven't talked about it because many of us believe, and I think I'm still more of a structuralist, that it's one thing to feel things and another thing to be able to act on that. And I think one of the things dictators do is make people angry, outraged, but under certain circumstances, they induce a sense of impotence. And under other circumstances, they induce a sense of incredible empowerment and belief in their own capacity. Now, what Adrian and I've been arguing with everybody on this listserv, but the argument I've been having with Adrian was on food prices. And this is why I objected to arguments that stressed food prices. I don't think there is a single event that all of a sudden produced all of these protest movements at the same time. Rather, I think, much as in Eastern Europe, that there was demonstration impact, that one movement showed it could be done, and that made another movement believe it was possible. And that made others believe it was possible. So it was that new sense of their own capacity and the vulnerability and weaknesses of these regimes that people who had long suffered under these regimes, long hated these regimes, hated them for their inequality, for the corruption, for their murder and torture of the ones they loved, their friends, their community members. These things of these perverse impacts of repression is that repression makes people want to topple regimes. But people need to have the sense that it's possible. And the longer these regimes stay in power, the more beaten down people feel. So what changed everything in the Middle East? Tunisia. Now, I'm not going to talk much about Tunisia because, interestingly enough for me, Tunisia to me looks like my other case, which is France, because it seems to me a really almost spontaneous response to police violence. A massive increased number of police killings, and I think it just, from what I see, just simply took Ben Ali by surprise. Not knowing how to respond, the military being unwilling to join the police, he leaves, and the Egyptians say, wow. The Egyptians, by the way, have all these contact with underground movements in Tunisia. The Egyptians, much like the Chileans, have been working for years, reestablishing social networks, creating connections, transforming the popular culture and sense of what is possible. And they have been active. There have been labor movements and labor strikes and student protests. So there is not a simply spontaneous uprising to, I don't want to caricature, but to something like food prices. There is the ability to take advantage of what is seen as a new opportunity.